Hey guys, it's Taylor and I am a freak for the English language. Kind of sad, I know, but we're here, we're queer, and we love Shakespeare. If you guys are a long-term viewer of this channel, then you will know that I have always had a knack for the English language. When I was younger, I would write poems and short, crappy stories, but as I got older, I developed into much longer projects. And I'm currently writing a novel. Writing has always been my passion, and I found most of my joy in fictional worlds on paper. With all that being said, I am in higher level English, and I'm going to be doing my leaving cert this school year, so for my last year of being obligated to give a fuck about this rather than it being my choice to, I thought I'd help out people who might be struggling with this subject. And I would do it the only way I knew how, by making a video. The Irish Leaving Cert course consists of 8 poets, 2 plays, a novel, and a movie. And as far as I am planning to go, I'm going to be handpicking poets that I particularly like and have particular favoritism for my videos. I won't do all 8 unless you guys absolutely want me to. Then comment down below. I'll do it. I have no problems, but as far as I know, that is all I'm going to be doing. There is also the play King Lear and the 3 mediums for the comparative study that I would have to do all of them together, which is why I don't really want to. That's a lot of work to make in a video, and also I hate most of them. I like The Plow on the Stars, and then there's Foster, which is a novel, and then there's the movie Children of Men, and I didn't like them at all, so I don't really want to cover them in a video. But if you guys are totally interested in it, then I have no problems. I'm only here to help you guys out, so comment down below what you do want me to do. And for all my junior cert buds, I am totally interested in covering the play Romeo and Juliet. I might be a teeny tiny bit rusty because it has been 2 years, but it is one of my favorite plays of all time, specifically Shakespeare, but just in general, one of my favorite plays of all time. So I have no problems with rereading the whole play, making out little notes, giving you guys all that information. So if you want it, comment down below. If you don't, less work for me. If you've already graduated, or you're nowhere near your leaving cert, or you go on YouTube to get away from school, I totally get it if this series isn't for you. Don't worry, my vlogs, covers, funny videos, talkative, story times, they'll all continue to go out on this channel. The educational stuff will only be every other month or so, so please don't unsubscribe. And finally, we dive into the fray with Mr. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a possibly gay, young enough, well-off family-wise, Victorian-era Englishman. Daddy Hopkins was a published poet, and his son followed quickly in his footsteps, but not quite enough when he swayed from his strictly Anglican parents to become a Catholic priest in later life. But before all that, Hopkins was an intelligent and well-liked kid. Minus a few bumps in the road, he was well-behaved, scholarly inclined, and got on great with his fellow students. A steep contrast to the social treatment he experienced as an adult professor in Dublin. When he taught in Ireland, Hopkins was a bit of an outcast due to the stress that weighed on him, his over-the-top work schedule, and his harmful tendencies toward himself that had developed in his younger years. Joining Catholicism became almost a trend for people Hopkins' age. They often joined because of Mass's theatrical appeal to them. The rich symbolism attracted artistic students, whilst the strict discipline attracted Hopkins. And to say he fell head over heels in love with his remastered faith is the understatement of the century. Hopkins and God had a pretty steady relationship, making an appearance in all of his poetry. Hopkins wrote about the goodness of God, the gloriousness of self-sacrifice, and the beauty in all of God's creations, all themes woven into his nature poems. He believed wholeheartedly in God's love until 1877, when his teaching took him to places like Liverpool and Dublin. For multiple reasons, such as loneliness, homesickness, bodily illness, stress of being overworked, and his personal struggle with unholy sexual desires, Hopkins became depressed. Alone in cities far from the nature he loved, with his own sexual desires eating away at his mental health, Hopkins felt abandoned by the God he had devoted himself to wholeheartedly, and became extremely self-loathsome, suffering with suicidal thoughts. During his final years before his death, age 44, he wrote poems of his mental anguish and torment. He self-describes them as the Terrible Sonnets. When answering a question on Hopkins, remember to split your essay into 3 sections. The first being his joyous poems that he wrote when he saw beauty and innocence in all of nature, having an optimistic view on the world, because it was the world his loving God had created and existed in all of its creatures, plants, and other commodities. The second section is of the poems he wrote when he was growing toward darkness and sadness, but tried to fight his misery with meaningless stanzas and empty lines in his otherwise upsetting poems. And finally, we have the Terrible Sonnets that he wrote during his time of dejection, During this time, he felt abandoned by God in his time of need and hated himself because of it. He believed that God did not love him because he wasn't good enough for God's compassion. This may have been because of his self-discomfort regarding his sexual desires. During this time, he suffered from insomnia, a self-described twisted mind, suicidal wishes, and feelings beyond sorrow. It is a shame he died feeling this way. Let's start with God's Grandeur. God's Grandeur is a poem in which Hopkins explores the theme of God. Shocker, I know. And his presence in everything, specifically nature. Again, shocker, I know. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. One of Hopkins' favorite writing techniques is using words with multiple meanings. An example of this is the word charged in the first line. Charged can mean charged with electricity, like a modern phone. The world is brought to life by God's greatness. But charged can also mean charged with committing a crime. The world is full of sinful crimes that God will punish us for. Despite his wholehearted belief in God's love and kindness, Hopkins still feared him as a judge-like figure. Another frequently used poetic technique Hopkins tends to favor is alliteration, the repetition of consonants in a sentence. Examples of it in this poem include the grandeur in God, flame out from foil, shining from shook foil, gathers to a greatness, ooze of oil, wreck his rod, seared, smeared, trade with toil, man smudge, man smell, foot, feel, dearest freshness deep down, last lights, west went, brown brink, and finally, world broods, warm breast, with bright wings. You wouldn't need to say all of them in the exam, perhaps just learn off the last one and two others of your choice. If alliteration is repetition of consonants, then assonance is the repetition of vowels. An example of assonance would be the ooze of oil. Assonance gives a musical effect to convey the sound written. Another example being shining from shook foil, because it sounds like you're shaking it and it's going shh. I'm so very intelligent. Hopkins has a habit of leaving out words to both emphasize what is being said and to fit the rhythm of the poem. Example being deep down things rather than deep down in things. Overall, the poem is about God's energy being present in everything, shimmering through things like the light shimmering off of tinfoil. He uses tons of metaphors such as the liquid from crushed olives gathering in a pool of greatness. The isolation of the word crushed suggests two meanings. Hopkins was quite the environmentalist, as seen through plenty of his poems, so the use of the word crushed both highlights the destruction of nature and his crushed spirit at the sight of God's beautiful creations being harmed. Hopkins believes that people have no respect for the earth God blessed them with. The people do not wreck his rod, fear his punishment for such actions, or that generations have trod, using repetition to symbolize the mindless trampling of nature by sinful people. Hopkins ends the first stanza by stating how horrible he believes human activity has been on God's planet, referencing to the impact of furnaces, smoke from factories, and pollution have left on the world. And all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. In the second stanza, he leaves us on the optimistic note that no matter what we do, nature can never truly be destroyed. And for all this, nature is never spent. The endless possibilities of renewal for nature are, in Hopkins' opinion, due to God's undying presence flowing through everything. It ends on a positive piece of imagery of God as a dove wrapping its protective wings around the world. World broods with warm breast, and with bright wings. Moving on to spring, the first stanza is full of positive, vivid descriptions of nature during the spring months. It opens with a very matter-of-fact and certain statements that nothing is so beautiful as spring, followed by alliteration galore, when weeds in wheels, repetition of the W, shoot long and lovely and lush, repetition of the L. Hopkins' compliment towards weeds is an example of his immense positivity and the extremely joyous tone overall, because weeds are usually a bad thing, but he thinks that they're beautiful and wonderful and great. Once again, using assonance, Hopkins makes the sound of lightning flashes with the repetition of the letter I. It strikes like lightning to hear him sing. A recurring Hopkins technique is to reflect on the things spoken about in the first stanza in the second stanza. In the second stanza, Hopkins discusses the beauty of the nature that started it all, the Garden of Eden. He discusses the joy the garden must have brought Adam and Eve before their sin clouded its beauty. Using alliteration, Cloud cries, sorrow is sinning, most O maids, and worthy the winning, in the third stanza, he uses the metaphor of Eve's apple for her virginity. The sin that clouded the world's view of beautiful nature and beautiful holiness being that of sex. Is it bad I didn't know that that was a metaphor for so long? We'll leave that. Moving on. The poem ends with the plea of, God, please protect the children from sin, innocent mind, and mayday in girl and boy. Another short poem by Hopkins is Pied Beauty. Pied Beauty begins with a prayer-like sentence, glory be to God for dappled things. Dappled and brinded meaning spotted, whilst pied meaning colourful. Stipple, on the other hand, means speckled. Try not to mix them up, I find such a task difficult myself. Evident from this poem, Hopkins clearly favoured alliteration, examples being couple, colour, fresh, fire, coal, chestnut, falls, finches, plotted and pierced, fold, fallow, trades, tackle, trim, fickle, freckled, father's fourth, and swift, slow, sweet, sour, which are also examples of contrasting opposites. Overall, this poem is a description of God's creations, sounding almost like a hymn in its description of God's harmony with the world. Some can even describe it as Hopkins' love letter to God, in the way he marvels at their awesome talent and celebrates their work throughout. Moving on, we have The Windhover, one of the more complicated of his works. The Windhover is a sonnet that describes a falcon flying and compares its gracefulness to God. One infamous use of Hopkins' favourite alliteration appears in the second sentence, Kingdom of daylight's dauphin dappled dawn drawn. Throughout this poem, Hopkins uses the extended metaphor of the bird as a prince on a horse trotting around a ring, the prince, of course, being Jesus Christ. He compares the way the horse moves to the falcon riding euphorically on the wind current circling its prey. The first stanza is full of Hopkins' excitement for seeing such skill as he describes the bird's joy as it fights against the wind. The heart in hiding, stirred for a bird. The achieve of, he stumbles over his own excitement, the mastery of the thing. In the second stanza, Hopkins is a big old show-off by using the repetition of the letter S, which is also known as sibilance, to sound like an ice skater on an ice ring. Skates, heel, sweeps, smooth. Like a figure skater on ice. In the second stanza, his usual reflection appears in which he describes the qualities of the bird. Brute, beauty, and valour and act, o air, pride, plume. The falcon's beauty, brutishness, air used for transport, pride, and gorgeous feathers, here buckle, are all tied together with a neat little belt buckle that make up the bird. But buckle has two meanings, and the other is to collapse under tension or pressure, which is the new extended metaphor of the poem. In the third stanza, he describes a fire collapsing into embers that are beautiful and comparable to Christ's suffering and death on the cross before rising again, thus being the spoken about beauty. The fire that breaks from thee, the spirit that buckled free from Jesus' body when he died on the cross, saved the world from its own sin. And thus ends the last of Hopkins' joyous poems. On to his middle poems. Inversnade, my actual favourite. Inversnade is set in the Scottish Highlands in a beautiful pond nature scene. Now, Hopkins' joyous poems would describe the beauty of the pond as magnificent and an example of God's talent and goodness, but instead he describes it as darksome, with horseback brown water. Much like the little pond, his mind is becoming polluted with his negativity and looming sadness. But Hopkins' talent didn't die until he did. To convey the Scottish accent, you must roll his repeated use of the oars. This darksome burn, horseback brown, his rollrock highroad roaring down. Please excuse that accent. He uses alliteration, coop in comb, fleece of foam, flute, falls, low lakes, fawn froth, and wildness wet weeds. The first stanza describes the foamy polluted water, whilst the second stanza describes its enticing movements. It rounds and rounds, despair to drowning. Hopkins personifies despair as it tempts him to drown himself in the bog water. In the third stanza, the pond separates into two streams, a sexual metaphor for two open legs. To modern people, this is a bit crude, but to Hopkins, this was downright sinful. An indication of Hopkins' straining mental health is such references to unholy acts, especially for a priest. In my personal opinion, Hopkins' final stanza comes across as having been thrown on at the last minute. He must have noticed how upsetting the rest of the poem was and wanted to fix things so they resembled his usual happy poems. So he tacked on an almost journalistic style stanza before things got too dismal. Oh, let them be left, wilderness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. Doesn't feel very Hopkins to me. His final middle poem is Felix Randall, which is a poem about a blacksmith Hopkins tended to in his final years of life before the poor fellow passed away. It opens with a very conversational tone, as if Hopkins is being told of Felix's passing. Felix Randall the farrier. Oh, is he dead then? My duty all ended. He doesn't have to visit him anymore, but truly he'll miss him greatly. Using alliteration, Hopkins describes the man he had been tending to. Mold of man, big-boned, hardy, handsome. He fell into a deep depression when he first discovered he was sick. He suffered from a racing mind and became angry, but soon began to accept his condition. Despite slowly losing his own faith in a loving God, Hopkins still believed the religious services he performed for Felix helped him find peace. He mended, being anointed and all. Overall, Hopkins had grown fond of Felix, feeling that he was rewarded with his company for his work. Feeling sorry for him, Hopkins hoped his prayers and gentle touch helped to comfort him in any way. He had become attached to him. Thy tears that touched my heart, child, my tongue that taught thee comfort, touch had quenched thy tears. The poor old sod never upset anybody. God rest him all road ever he offended. He was a good man, and so he shall be remembered. Hopkins does not end the poem on an image of Felix in a grave or dying in his bed, but instead the final stanza depicts him in his prime years. Who could ever think of such a future for such a once mighty man? A man who was the king of his own metaphorical kingdom, Random Grim Forge, and a man popular amongst his friends, powerful amidst peers. Hopkins ends the poem on the image of Felix fixing a horseshoe with a hammer, like the burly giant he once was. Despite the poem's topic of depression and illness, as well as the death of a good person, it ends on a positive note. The last Hopkins poem to do so. The first of Hopkins' terrible sonnets is the howl of mental torment, that is, no worse there is none. The title meaning that there is no rock bottom. There is no such thing as the worst way someone can feel, because things will only continue to get worse. We open with the declaration, no worse there is none, pitched past pitch of grief. The word pitched has multiple meanings. Pitch black, as in the darkness he feels trapped in. Pitch as in thrown. Hopkins felt like he had been thrown beyond sadness, believing that your mental suffering only teaches your mind how to feel worse tomorrow, resulting in no relief from his misery. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this poem is when Hopkins cries out for God and the Virgin Mary. Comforter, where is your comforting? Mary, Mother of us, where is your relief? Suddenly, he no longer sees God in nature, nor does he believe in God's presence in the world. He believes that God has abandoned him, which is agonizing for Hopkins, who has devoted his whole life to his faith and served the Lord so loyally. Hopkins compares himself to a piece of iron, stretched and beaten. His mind is twisted and tortured. An age-old anvil, wince and sing. Even in his misery, Hopkins uses personification to personify fury as it roars at him, driving him toward his own insanity. Hopkins uses the extended metaphor of a mountain range to describe the highs and lows of his mentality. The lows are feelings of depression and self-loathing, whilst the highs are also dangerous, as you are hanging on the edge of a cliff. He states that if you've never experienced such sorrows and grief, you can never truly understand and will take it for granted that you don't feel this way. He ends on the idea that his only comfort is his inevitable death and brief encounters with death in sleep. And finally, we have I Wake and Feel the Fell of Dark, a poem wrought with self-loathing and mental suffering. The opening sentence states that Hopkins wakes up in the middle of the night due to his developing insomnia. But fell has multiple meanings. A favorite technique by Hopkins, as I'm sure you've noticed. Fell can mean to fall emotionally, and that the darkness was cruel. Fell meaning wickedness and cruelty in Olden English. Hopkins personifies his emotions, specifically his depression. He asks his heart what sights it has seen on its journey into sadness. And yet despite all this sadness, more is to come. And more must in yet longer's lights delay. At the end of the first stanza, Hopkins describes how he has cried to God in prayer for what feels like years. He uses the metaphor of sending letters that get no reply, to describe his unanswered prayers and endless suffering. In the second stanza, Hopkins tells us his feelings toward himself. He is full of self-loathing, describing himself as vomit and heartburn. He describes himself as a bread God was making that turned sour. He tells us how every part of him, bones built in me, flesh filled, blood brimmed, they are all reasons as to why God abandoned him, because he is unworthy of God's love. Hopkins ends on the image of himself lower than those cast away at heaven's gates. He truly believes he is the lowest of the low. Before I go, I want you guys to know that if you ever feel like Hopkins did toward the end of his life, that there are so many helplines out there that will give you the time and the help that you need. That not only are there so many helplines, that there are so many people in this world who wholeheartedly care about you, who have so much care, so much love, and will do whatever it takes to help. You are so worthy of love, you are so worthy of friendship, of joy, of happiness. And if you don't feel that right now, there is no shame in looking for help, because there are so many people like you who care, who understand, and are there for you. And hey, I'm one of them. Anyway, hope you guys like this week's video. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more of my content, and don't forget to comment down below absolutely any video ideas you guys have, not even just educational ones, but just any old video idea that you guys might want me to do. I love you guys so much. Bye!